So I first got involved in political campaigning and activism as only just a teenager in the early 1980s. I was convinced that my generation were going to die in a nuclear holocaust. I got involved in anti-nuclear campaigning through a local youth C&D group. The women at the Green and Common Women's Peace Camp inspired me, and here they are dancing on what would become the missile silos. They inspired me through their daring, direct actions to try and stop the deployment of cruise missiles in England, and through their dedication. But they also inspired me through their queerness. The fact that, as much as the tabloid press used it as a weapon against them, so many Green women were visibly lesbians. But also in the queerness that, as Sasha Roseneal has described it, their queerness of breaking with normative assumptions of how women were supposed to act in public, how they were supposed to engage with the law, and how they were supposed to engage with politics. A queering of what politics could be like. So, as a young gay teenager, I saw kindred spirits. On the left, as you're looking at it, is Simon and Coley. Simon was one of the most high-profile, openly gay anti-apartheid leaders in South Africa in the 1980s. He was simultaneously involved in anti-apartheid campaigning, but also in building non-racial gay communities in the Johannesburg area. In the late 1980s, he was charged with treason for his anti-apartheid activities. And to the discomfort of some of his co-defendants, several of whom are current government ministers in post-apartheid ANC governments, he refused to hide his sexuality during that treason trial. He's pictured here on the non-stop picket of the South African Embassy in London in the late 1980s, just after his release. Simon's trial, and also that of Ivan Toms, a white gay doctor who was imprisoned for refusing to serve in the South African Army. Simon was central, or their cases were central to the non-stop picket's attempt to engage lesbian and gay communities in London in anti-apartheid solidarity activism. A sewing together, a connecting of common interests, or uncommon interests perhaps. Now, the other man, I'm sure even if you don't recognise him, many of you are now familiar with his story. It's Mark Ashton, who helped found Lesbian and Gay Support the Miners. So his story has partly been told in the film Pride. But interestingly, of course, that film plays down the fact that Mark was simultaneously, at the same time as his involvement in Lesbian and Gay Support the Miners, he was also General Secretary of the Young Communist League. There are lots of similarities between Simon and Coley and Mark Ashton. They both helped build intersectional solidarity between LGBT communities and others in struggle, connecting the struggle for LGBT rights with broader human rights struggles. We might want to think about the institutions and infrastructures that helped articulate those solidarities. The Gays That Work bookshop in London, the Delight of Miners welfare in South Wales, the Bell gay bar in King's Cross, and how so much of Simon and Coley's work in and around Johannesburg was about the building of a non-racial gay infrastructure in South Africa. Although Simon and Mark both helped weave connections between struggles, their stories and the ways they are remembered also reveal the ways in which identity boundaries are policed, and how LGBTQ people can sometimes be encouraged to make choices between engaging with issues around sexuality and broader issues of social justice. So let's pay attention to the connections that are overlooked, the connections that are denied or left unjoined, as much as we pay attention to those that are reconnected. If I started the 1980s fearing nuclear holocaust, it's probably fair to say that I ended that decade fearing that I would die young of AIDS, like both Mark Ashton and Simon and Coley did. I leave these images here to think about the legacies of gay community responses to HIV and AIDS. And I also think it's really important in some ways to leave it here to think, if we're thinking about intersectional struggles, if we're thinking about privilege, then I also think looking at gay men's activism at the height of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s shows the way in which sometimes privilege can be levered for greater social justice. You think in many ways what inspired some of the campaign of ACT UP and others was precisely the fact that here were a group of highly educated white gay men predominantly who were suddenly having their privilege ripped from under them and doing something about it. So I leave these images here to think about the legacies of gay community responses to HIV and AIDS, but as a reminder to read my lips, a reminder of why we kiss. In this session, I hope we can think about how we can use these struggles from the 1980s and other decades as usable pasts, activist lessons that can inspire and inform our strategies and tactics today, through their victories, through their failures, and through their mistakes. But also, as we think about how we each reconnect with diverse struggles around sexuality and gender in the contemporary world, I hope that we can think of community building alongside confrontational direct action and avoid false choices between the politics of pleasure and real politics on the streets. So we'll come back to some of those things, hopefully, in a moment. And so we can continue some of those conversations. But I also want to show you an image that in part explains what was going on around you while you were chatting. I suspect one or two people in the audience who are roughly my age might recognise it, others might not. I started with an image from Greenham Common, and here's another. Inspired by a group of women from New England, called the Spinsters, another women's anti-nuclear group. Very frequently at Greenham Common, women used yarn, used webs as a weapon. So, as an act of direct action, as a way of blocking the building of the nuclear silos, as a way of blocking the cruise missiles from going out on manoeuvres. So I hope that acts as an exercise, the symbolism of the yarn and the spinning of a web serves to remind us that as we weave a web of connections, those connections might look thin and fragile, but they can be a weapon that obstructs injustice.